Well, without further ado, I think we'll get things going. Thanks to the hundreds of you who came out tonight on this snowy Montpelier evening. Thanks for braving the weather, and thanks to all of those watching from home who perhaps made the wiser choice to
Don't insult our audience right off the bat.
No, that's bad call. But truly, thank you all for being here, and welcome to the midpoint of our Naturalist Journeys presentation series this year. This year is all about healthy and sustainable forests in Vermont, and how different folks in the forestry and conservation community around the state are thinking about this topic. In some cases, it's how can felling a tree sometimes be the right call for biodiversity, and in other cases like tonight, what happens when we let the forest just do its own thing? How can we enhance the forest's ability to regain its own autonomy? And so this is a really exciting part of our series tonight. If you haven't seen the other programs in this series, I invite you to go to our website, northbranchnaturecenter.org/presentations. You can find all of the recordings of not just this year's presentations, but also the last many years as well. So, and also all the live streams of and recordings of our future talks will be found there as well. So I want to just say a quick thank you to our sponsors. Thanks to our lead sponsors, Hunger Mountain Co-op and 802 Coffee, for making Naturalist Journeys free to everybody to be able to attend. And also thanks to those of you that supported this program by donating when you registered. So North Branch Nature Center, thanks you. Our presenters, thank you. The forest, thank you. Let's see. A couple last quick housekeeping things before we introduce Shelby. We can hold questions till the end. There'll be plenty of opportunity to do questions at the end. And also, those of you that are watching online, feel free to put questions in the YouTube chat, and I'll be moderating those. So there's definitely a delay between when you put in the question and when we see it. And so if you have a question, throw it in there early. I'm hearing myself talking on my computer in the back, which is proving that delay. So I'll go turn that off before Shelby starts. But yeah, please hold your questions to the end. Use the online feature for those of you watching from home. With that, please help me welcome Shelby Perry from Northeast Wilderness Trust, Wildlands Ecology Director, and tonight's presenter. Thanks, Shelby.
Thanks, Sean. There's not a lot of you, and microphones make me kind of nervous, and I have one for the people online. So I wonder if I can just talk without the microphone. Can everyone hear me fine? Wonderful. I'm going to just turn this a little sideways. Okay. Okay, so my presentation tonight is called Wilderness Works 2, The Promise of Passive Rewilding. And the framing of this whole speaker series was a lot of stuff about sort of forest management and forestry. So I'm introducing myself as Wildlands Ecology Director, which is my job title. Thank you, Sean, for introducing me. But for tonight, I am going to be your passive rewilding guide. I was going to put like passive rewilding forester, and then I was like, I think I'm going to leave it guide. So as your passive rewilding guide, whenever I'm guiding anything, I always start with a to-do list, and the same tonight. So I got out my little notebook from my little forestry vest, and I made this list. And I'm going to start by introducing myself, which I just did, so woohoo. And next, I'm going to introduce you. So whenever I do these things, I'm often talking from a human sort of perspective. And I thought, wouldn't it be neat if my audience tonight tried to take on somebody else's perspective to watch? So I'm going to give you options of whose perspective to take to watch this presentation. And I want you all to pick one. And it's going to be like kind of like a video game where you get to like pick your avatar, okay? So first up is the hemlock tree, the beautiful and charismatic hemlock tree. Here goes, woo. Okay, so there's a hemlock tree. Option 1, fun facts about hemlock trees. They are really good at growing in shade. They like to be under the shade of a canopy. They can live for decades underneath other trees before they get a little window of light and can, grow faster and take advantage. They are a friend to cold water fish. They hang over streams and they keep them nice and cool. And that's a really important service that they provide because lots of fish like cold water. They can live to be 600 to 1,000 years old. They're the longest lived tree in in the Northeast. And I took that factoid from Wetland, Woodland, Wildland, the book about Vermont natural communities. So if it's wrong, come for them. All right, next option, the winter wren. These guys are tiny, but they have big songs. Ooh, more people, welcome. Okay, so I'm just gonna give you guys a little background because you're just walking in. I'm asking you to pick a perspective to watch from. So the winter wren was described by naturalist John Burroughs as having a vibrating tongue of silver for their long and beautiful song. And I was gonna try to play it for you, but that proved too technically confusing. So if you haven't heard it, go home and Google it. They have really beautiful songs. I learned this in preparing for this presentation. The male winter wren will come back to the same territory year after year. He will build nests, multiple nests, usually around 6, sometimes up to 12. And then when the female returns, he will show her around. And she will pick her favorite and finish it by lining it with soft, fuzzy things, and that's where they will raise their family. And if he gets a really good territory, sometimes he'll get 2 ladies. Next up. Okay, next up is a newt. Because I work for Newt, Northeast Wilderness Trust, I had to pick our unofficial mascot, the newt. The eastern newt, fun facts, starts life in the water, goes into a terrestrial midlife phase where they go a-wandering. I've heard it described by just a friend of mine as their Kurt Vonnegut phase, where they're out on the road. And then they go back to water to lay their eggs. And I wrote in my notes to settle down and start a family, but they actually show no parental care for their young. So really it's just to have their babies. Some of them stay in the orange wandering phase for their entire life, and they'll turn into the aquatic phase briefly and mate, and then they'll go back to the orange wandering phase. Some of us are just wanderers all the way through and through. Oh, and they're slightly toxic, which is why they have that bright orange skin and you can see them everywhere, but they don't get eaten immediately. Okay, last one, because I'm me, and if you know me, which at least half of you do. I don't ever do a presentation without including a slime mold. So this is honeycomb coral slime mold. And there's sort of 2 morphs of it. One looks just like honeycomb, this one looks just like coral. This is a soil-dwelling amoeba. It is a fearsome predator of bacteria and dead leaves. It is often confused with cellular slime mold. If anyone has ever told you about a slime mold and said, oh, it's a bunch of little individual organisms and they come together and they make one fruiting body, that's a cellular slime mold. All the ones you can see in the forest are plasmodial slime molds like this guy. They can solve mazes and they display all kinds of forms of intelligence with no visible to humans' brain. So we don't know how they do it, how they remember things or solve puzzles, but they can. And they have 2 dormant phases in their life cycle. So if conditions no longer favor them, they can just dry up into a little dormant phase, and they can be that until conditions are good for them again, and then they'll sort of rehydrate, come back to life, and be a living, moving being again. And they reproduce like mushrooms using spores, but they are sort of an animal. All right, so these are your choices for this evening's presentation. I hope you all pick one in your head. I'm not gonna make you shout it out, just pick your favorite. And I want you to try to have that perspective for the rest of it. So back to my to-do list. I have introduced me and you, and now we're gonna get to know some land. Because rewilding is much more interesting in practice than it is in theory. So I picked one Northeast Wilderness Trust preserve, this is the Durin Mountain Wilderness Preserve, to be sort of our piece of land where what we're gonna be thinking about today. So Durand Mountain Wilderness Preserve, established in 2020. Northeast Wilderness Trust owns the property, but we're talking about rewilding, right? And so the word, just sort of by virtue of itself, rewilding, implies that the place has lost some wildness at some point in its history, and we're trying to bring it back. So I'm not going to go deep into forest history here, but I think a lot of us know the Northeast, well, a whole big area of the northern forest was once predominantly forested, and then there was a period of time where it kind of shrunk down to being mostly open, and then it has come back in the greatest recovery story of all time to being mostly forested again. But those forests are not the same as they were before. They were predominantly in a pretty old forest state with real structural complexity and a lot of stuff going on. And we have pretty simple and uncomplicated forests now. We also regularly do forest management in our forests for a variety of reasons, for timber or wood, firewood, or for paper products, or because we're trying to do habitat enhancement, any number of management objectives that we might have. What you can't see in this photo, you can see the logging roads. What you can't see is that under that tree canopy are old stone walls and barbed wire, because at some point it was probably a field, or parts of it were, or at least a pasture that was used by animals grazing perhaps under trees or perhaps in an open conditions. So we're talking about this property, and it's not a perfect shining example of an old forest. It's a pretty young, uncomplicated forest, but it is a forest nonetheless. And we're looking at it as though we're these guys up in the corner here. And they're all still there. So I'm going to put them where they're most likely to be. There's a little hemlocky ridge down here just above this. This is a big swamp overlooking this big, beautiful swamp. Up on the ridge just below the summit of Durand Mountain, some of the bigger trees stuck around. That's where the winter wrens might want to make their nests. The newt goes up there in the beaver pond because they go into their aquatic phases, and that's a good spot for them. And then the slime mold can be basically anywhere it's moist enough for them to move around. I'm going to show you a couple pictures of this place. Ooh, that was fun. There are some big old trees. This is a cedar in that cedar swamp that was along the road. So there are some legacy big trees. There is some coarse woody debris. It's mostly small diameter. We're looking at like little broken sticks and logs and things. This right here is a different slime mold. And then that last one is the beaver pond in fall foliage, looking so pretty. But when you get into the forest, most of it looks kind of uncomplicated, mostly the same age, pretty simple understory. This is sort of a classic old cleared area. Lots of forests are like this. You've got some dead trees. They're all pretty small diameter. We're looking at like 5 or 6 inches. And they're mostly the same age. We don't have a lot of regeneration, young trees growing up underneath. We have very uncomplicated shrub layer and no real seedlings or saplings coming in. So that's our piece of land. Oh, now I'm going to cross them all off. Woo. All right, so now we're going to identify our management objectives. And we're going to go through each of your perspectives, and I, as your guide, I'm going to guide you through what your management objectives might be for this property. And I'm going to caution that all of these creatures that I picked for you to have as your perspective for this presentation, they're all really common, and they're all everywhere around here. You can find all of these things easily in the summer. You can find hemlock now. The rest of them would be pretty tricky. So I hope you all go visit them. I hope you inhabit this perspective for longer than just now, and you go meet your local winter wrens and newts and slime molds and hemlocks. But them being common, I want to make an important distinction, which is to say, when we're thinking about their management objectives, I want us to be thinking not about what they can handle or what they can survive and still be there. I want you to be thinking about what their goals might be to thrive in this forest. What do they need to be for it to be the best home for them that it can be? All right, so we're gonna start with hemlock, because I'm just gonna keep doing them in the same order. So, what would hemlock's management objectives be? Well, shade, because that's where your competitive advantage is, right? Other trees will grow faster than you in brighter light. But your real bread and butter is growing slow and steady underneath other trees. You would want a messy forest floor. This is important because you are delicious to deer, and you need a bunch of things making a mess that deer can't easily climb over to eat you. You want other big trees because you're going to tap into a mycelial network to connect with other trees to help you grow, to learn about pests, to help cope with things like drought and stuff like that. You want dead trees laying down and standing up. Those are called snags when they're standing up. Laying down, they're sometimes called coarse woody debris. And you want those because you have pretty small seeds, and when you get on the forest floor, it can be hard to get your roots right into the ground, and you need nutrients pretty quickly. But you can grow on logs and things that are above the forest floor. Those are often called nurse logs if you see a tree starting on top of it. It'll grow on top of a decomposing old tree, and then later, when you see that tree as an adult, you'll see its roots kind of go down and around a log that's no longer there, or a stump that's no longer there. And you need thick duff layers, spongy moss, moisture, and humidity. This stuff is on the forest floor, and the northern forest in particular really holds moisture like a sponge. It's why it doesn't burn like western forests. And you need those thick layers because if you've ever grown a garden and you've had little tiny seedlings out on a sunny day on bare dirt, they dry up, and drying up is dying. So you need that wetness. You need spongy wood and spongy humus on the forest floor. All right, now for those of you who picked the winter wren, let's go through your management objectives. You also want that messy forest floor because you forage down there, you catch little bugs and things. You also want those dead trees laying down and standing up. That's where you build your nest, or one of the places. You want uneven terrain on the forest floor where pools will form, because that's where mosquitoes breed. And though we might hate mosquitoes and other bugs, birds love to eat them. So it's important that they have a place to breed and grow. You want tipped over trees in particular. Winter wrens are specialists at building their nests in the root ball of a tipped over tree. So when a mature tree tips over and it rips up a bunch of dirt and soil, the winter wrens will build a nest in that tipped up ball of dirt. You want those thick duff layers with the spongy moss and moisture and humidity because you eat bugs, and bugs need to not dry out also. And you need epiphytes. Epiphytes are plants that grow on plants. Around here, they're mostly things like moss and lichens, which are not technically plants probably, but we're gonna call them epiphytes. And sometimes there's some other things that grow on them, but those are important for you because you will build your nest in them on the live trees. One of those 12 nests you might disguise in some of those epiphytes, especially big shaggy lichen and stuff. You need to be able to hide to raise your young so that predators don't find them. All right, next up, the newt. What do you think are the newt management objectives? Well, you also need shade because you have a little tiny porous body and you will lose water quickly in the sun. You also need a messy forest floor because you're cruising around down there and you don't want anyone to step on you or squash you, and you want lots of places to hide and to hunt for food. You also want dead trees, although the standing up ones are less important, but the laying down ones, you go under and you spend the winter under there, and you also hide under there on sunny or dry days. You want that uneven terrain with places for water to pool because you breed in vernal pools, and that's when sometimes you go into them and you go back out, but they're a really important part of your life cycle. Also, you eat a lot of mosquitoes, and mosquitoes also like vernal pools. You want tipped over trees, because tipped over trees is how those vernal pools are often made. That root wad that gets ripped out of the ground for the winter wren to build the nest on leaves a hole, and that hole will fill up with water over time, and that water can be a vernal pool. And you want thick duff layers. You can see this little guy is walking in an old forest. You can see how wet that is. That's humus and decomposing leaves, but it's wet, 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 and that helps you stop from drying out. Drying out is dying when you're a newt. It's also dying when you're a slime mold. So, slime mold objectives. We've already kind of been here. Any slimy things, they need shade. Sun will dry them out fast. You need a messy forest floor. You eat decomposers. You need lots of things decomposing for you to eat. You need dead trees because you're going to climb up on them to fruit, because you want your spores to go far, to spread your seed and start new lives. So you want dead trees that you can, slime up onto and make your little fruiting bodies. You want uneven terrain, because where there's places for water to pool, the water table's higher, the moisture is held in that humus layer, everything stays spongy and wet, and you want those thick duff layers for the humidity, just like the newt. So here's all of our management objectives. All of our avatars have given us their list, and I've compiled them into one big list for us. And this is what we want. So now we're gonna write our management plan. What tools can we use to develop these things? Well, if you're an astute reader, you might recognize these are the characteristics of old forests. And even though these beings are very common, all of the ones that I picked in our forests of today, it's really no surprise that they need the structure and functions of old forests, because that's what they evolved with here. That's what they kind of co-evolved with over time. And so all of these things, looking carefully, can happen with one primary management tool, and that is time. So there are some things that you can do to speed it up, like the winter wren might bring a skidder in there and rip down a couple trees to make those root wads to build their nest on, but they'd have to be careful about unintended consequences. Those wheel ruts from that skidder might mess up the hydrology and screw things up for the other guys who really need that moist forest floor. On the other hand, a hemlock could decide to cut down all the trees around them so that they get light, they get released, and they get to get bigger faster. But as they get bigger, what they want to do is tap into that mycelial network and connect with all the trees around them. And if they cut down all the trees around them, they're going to have gaps in that network that they're going to have to fill back in. So we have to think about the unintended consequences of our actions that we might take to make these management decisions. The one that's not going to have adverse complications for all of you, my wrens and hemlocks and slime molds and newts, is time. And we can do a lot of things with technology, but we cannot speed up time, unfortunately. So let's dig a little deeper into these timelines. I put forest development stages up here. I'm sorry if this font is a little small for the people online. I will read these for you. I put a little asterisk next to it because, one, these are rough forest developmental stages that I just sort of pulled out of my head from reading a bunch of literature. None of them are perfect. Please don't quote me directly on these. Two, these are all human categories, human-made categories. We made this, we called all these things these things. The forest does not think of itself as young or old growth. And the last thing I want to point out is that I did put old growth forest here. Well, I'll read these for the online people just in case. We're starting with a field or meadow. Each of these blue lines is 10 years. And then I marked the big ones, each 100 going down. We've got young forest in this light green color. It changes to mature forest, which is a forestry term. Mature usually means old enough to be profitable to cut down. Then there's a little overlap here between that mature and where I say old forest characteristics begin to develop. That starts to overlap here with old forest, where we start to get a lot of those structures. And then around 200 years old, that moves all over the place depending on where you are and what you're talking about. But around 200 years old, you start to see old growth forest, which I put in quotes for two reasons. One, some people, it's kind of a loaded term. Some people define old growth forest as forest that has never been cut. I don't like that definition because it means we can never have any more of it, and we have very little of it right now. The other thing I don't like about that definition is that it implies that forests cannot recover from us, that they cannot regain their full structure and function. If nothing can again be old growth forest, then once we've been somewhere, that place is just doomed. And so I don't like the use of that term in that way. So that's why I put it in quotes. But I do think old growth often is considered to start at around 200. So let me just scroll down quick in my notes, make sure I said all the things I wanted to say. I did, okay. So stretching that timeline out a little bit more, let's have a look at where we all are on it. The average lifespan of a winter wren, what do we think? About 6 years, 5 or 6 years. The oldest recorded one I read was 6 years, 7 months in the wild. So if we were starting with a meadow, they would probably not see anything but a meadow. What about a newt? What do we think we're talking about here? 2? Okay, all right. 15. Yeah, there we go. 12 to 14 years on average in the wild. 12 to 14 years. They're little guys too, but they are toxic, so I guess when nobody eats you, you can live for a while. All right, now I'm going to throw humans on there. The average lifespan of a human in the United States right now is 77. Fun fact, that's been going down. I just learned that today. Okay, hemlock. I already told you this. We're looking at 600 to 1,000 years for a max lifespan. That's the max. And the slime mold. This one's blurry. They have dormant phases. We don't really know how long those can last. These are little guys. We don't know a lot about them. They're not well understood. So I put infinity because I feel like who knows how long they could be dormant for, and then they might be able to just come back. We don't know. No one's studying it. They're not very well understood. And then just to be totally fair, because I picked hemlocks because hemlocks are one of my favorite trees, but they are, of course, the longest lived tree in the area. So I don't want to just like have the tree arrow going off the screen there without acknowledging that most of our local hardwood species average max lifespan is 300 to 500 years old. So beech, birch, maple, all of our sort of northern hardwood assemblage, they're in the 300 to 500 year old category. So that's why when we're looking at 200 or 300 years old, you're going to start to see a lot of trees that are reaching the end of their natural lifespan. For some reason, when I scroll, it doesn't move very fast. Okay, so just to sort of put that in some context, let's throw that little guy down there. His average lifespan. Well, the average lifespan of most of our hardwood trees takes up about 6 human lifespans. So why do we think forests can't recover? Because we watch them for our whole dang lives and we don't see a whole lot of change. But their lives are a lot longer than ours. And so that change is happening on a really different time scale. I said that wrong. What I meant to say, we watch them for our whole dang lives. We don't see them change unless we go in and make change. And that is something we really quite enjoy doing. We go in and we make some changes. And sometimes we do it because we want to speed up this process of old forest development. Sometimes we do it because we want trees to grow bigger and faster. And we can make big dead trees through management. We can make big live trees through management, but we can't make time. And human influence looms large in many forests in our region, and it can be hard to even see other perspectives sometimes. We're humans, and we think from a human perspective, go figure. But that was part of what I was trying to get at today by having you take on the perspective of these little guys up here. I want to think about the forests from someone who's not a human's perspective and what they might appreciate or want from a forest. And when we're stuck in our human lens, we sometimes miss or even just misinterpret the needs of other beings. Or sometimes we do this thing where we think of their needs and our wants, right? So we give them exactly what they need to survive and nothing more, to give us what we want to thrive. And so I think that's an important distinction, right? To think about, we say our management needs and what we need, but we're quite often going above and beyond what we need. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but I do think it's important to recognize. Taking an ecocentric perspective, meaning one that does not center the human needs, on just some parts of the landscape, and a couple examples of amounts that have been thrown out. Vermont Conservation Design says about 10% of the landscape should be in an old forest condition. The Wildlands Report, which was released by Wildlands, Woodlands, Farmlands, and Communities, was it a year ago or 2 years ago, John? A year and a half ago, says 10%, but evaluate up to 20% of our regions. That's not a very big piece of the puzzle, but it is an important piece of the puzzle in with all these other pieces that meet our other needs, right? We need to make sure we have that balance where everybody is being remembered and nobody's needs are being overlooked. Make room for the rest of life. So, we've done all of these things. Now we're going to fast forward, which is actually rather tricky to do. So we might go backwards. But I'm going to start by saying, coming back to this patch of land, when we're thinking about it from the wrens and the slime molds and the hemlocks perspective and the newts, the management tool we've opted to use is time. What can we expect to see in our lifetimes? And I'm going to throw all our little critters on this timeline. This forest is obviously not starting at meadow, right? We're a young forest here. So the wren and the newt, their whole lives are going to be in that young forest. They're going to see this piece. But many generations of them will live to see more. The hemlocks, however, they're going to get to see this forest get pretty old, probably. And the slime molds are infinite. They get to see everything. Whoop, and there's a little human. So we might get to see it start to develop old forest features. This forest, I was part of the team that protected this forest. So here's me right now. Probably the forest is around here. And in my lifespan, we'll probably get to, well, that seems generous, but if I was born right here, by the time we got to here, it'd be kind of old. So we'd be just seeing the beginning of those old forest characteristics. Wow, I wrote a lot of notes for that one, but I think I said them all. All right, so coming back to Durin Mountain. We can't go forward, so we're going to go backward. This is a fun exercise using the time slider in Google Earth. If you've never played with this tool, it's very fun. So back in time to 2003. This is before it was a wilderness preserve, but this is still called Durin Mountain, so I'm still going to call it Durin Mountain. It might be a little hard to see online, but there is a red property outline here. This is the approximate outline of the property. A few things I'll point out. This predates the most recent forest management, so the canopy is pretty intact on the property. I will also note that there were beavers here, and there aren't back then. So going back just a little over 20 years, there was no beaver pond there. All right, here it is in 2006. So this is right after that first big harvest. And, or it happened, I guess, somewhere in those 3 years, but they don't take pictures every year in the time slider, unfortunately. So you can see our landing, you can see a bunch of main sort of logging roads coming out, you can see the skid trails where they took out, ooh, it's very dark. Where they took out a bunch of the logs. This is probably helpful for this, because some of these images are a little dark. You get what you get with Google Time Slider. This is the summit, so what you can see is the steep part. The trees were left because it's hard to cut trees on steep slopes generally. This is the cedar swamp. You can see they made a little adventure down in there, but they didn't go far. And you can see this is all mostly open here, and there's scattered trees here. Those little dark green polka dots that's probably a shelter wood situation where they cut a lot of the basal area, but not all, left a couple trees standing. Okay, so now we're going to apply some time. Up next, 2011. Unfortunately, this was a cloudy day, so it's a little hard to see part of the property. But we're starting to see that recovery, right? Probably those big open areas came in, a bunch of shrubs. I'm guessing well, I know because I've walked around this property, probably blackberries and brambles and things that grow fast in full sun, filling this in. And next up, 2013, so now we're 10 years. Look who arrived. Oh wait, boo, yeah. The beavers arrived. It's very green. It's starting to thicken up a little bit. You see less exposed soil on those roads. They're not being used anymore. They're closing back in. Arrival of beavers, I will note, they are hydrology heroes. They block up little streams and add moisture back to a forest, and when skid ruts and things start pulling moisture off of a property, channeling water, sometimes they'll dam those up. On this particular property, they did build this dam, and then they did a whole bunch of stuff over here in wetlands. There's a bunch of sort of sprawling penned up water there now, which is pretty cool. And here's 2023. So we just watched 20 years pass on this property, and we saw a ton of progress. Like now we don't even see those blank spots. We see trees. There's mostly trees. They're pretty small, but there's mostly trees going in the areas that were cut. You see a shift in those open areas, first to shrubs, like I mentioned, then to saplings, and then to small trees. Still probably all sun-loving species. Those hemlocks are not really getting a foothold at this moment in time, except for maybe under those remaining canopies that were left from before. You saw the arrival of the beavers and the creation of new wetlands. Those new wetlands resulted in the thinning of some areas of those shrubs and small trees because beavers cut them down and they eat them. And you'd see the accumulation of 20 seasons of leaf litter and organic material. All the leaves and twigs and fine litter falls down and sits on the forest floor, and decomposers start to eat it, but it does build up, particularly when we have long, cold winters. Decomposition needs warmth. Cold makes it last longer, or take longer, happen more slowly. That's why cold areas tend to store more carbon in the soil, is that undecomposed stuff builds up for a long time and stays undecomposed because it's cold. So we're seeing that deposited material. I know hemlocks will get to see this forest get old, and probably the slime molds too, and many generations of wrens and newts will benefit from the many ecosystem services, which is a word we usually reserve for human benefits, but here I'm going to use it for all of you, my friendly slime molds and newts and wrens and hemlocks. And those include things like growing pools of carbon storage, clean and cool water that flows off the property, and the aesthetic and health benefits of intact forests. And so we've just watched this forest age 20 years. And we started at sort of zero almost, and we watched it get to now. But now we get to watch it go forever because that property is now protected as wilderness. So it's starting its process of passive rewilding, and it's only gonna keep going. So we've met me, and you've met you, and we got to know the land, and we got to know our management. We identified our management objectives. We fast forwarded through time, and now we're going to discuss. So this is my moment where I open it up to you to ask me questions about this process. And I want to say a big thank you to the Nature Center for having me, and thank you to Northeast Wilderness Trust for employing me, and that's all I got.
Remind folks who are watching online that you can add your questions to the YouTube chat as we go, and I'll use the opportunity to remind Shelby to repeat the questions because folks who ask them in this room won't be able to be heard online. Anyone in the room have a question to start? Yeah.
So what do you do about invasives if you're trying to leave everything alone?
Ah, someone always has to ask that question. Well, it all comes back to our objectives. And so, I guess I could turn it back around on you. Which one did you pick?
Winter wren.
You were a winter wren. So, if you were a winter wren and you wanted a messy forest floor, would you care where the messy forest floor plants came from?
Depends on the structure. So, Phragmites matches.
Maybe. That's true. Those two are probably less likely to overlap in a big way, I guess, because the winter wrens are more in the forest and the Phragmites is often not under a canopy. But yes, so I guess it depends somewhat on the structure, but I would say by and large, nature is not that concerned with where something came from, not as much as people are. We are really worried about that, and you know, rightfully so. We've seen that things that come from other places that don't have any pests here tend to outcompete native species, and that feels really yucky to watch because we love our plants and animals and natural communities here, and it kind of sucks to see them losing the, you know, head to head to find space in the world. But I guess two things. One, those invasive species get their competitive edge generally from disturbance. They all are species, well, herbaceous, I should say, plants are all mostly species that thrive on disturbance, and they're mostly around edges. So in my mind, if you are removing the element of frequent human disturbance in the forest, you're taking away some of that competitive advantage of those plants. And it's hard for them to spread under a closed forest canopy without that sort of help of the opening of the canopy and the equipment that moves in seeds and things like that. Now, there are certainly invasive species that spread under a closed canopy forest. It's like naive to act like they're not there, but taking away that regular disturbance takes away the competitive advantage of some of them. So hopefully they are on a little bit more of a level playing field. And then with others, you know, right now, Northeast Wilderness Trust, we don't do any management for invasive species. For that reason, the less disturbance gives them less competitive edge, and also because it's expensive, complicated work, and we've just decided to allocate our budget to protecting more land instead of sort of picking who gets to live on the land that we've already protected. I have a lot of strong feelings about invasive species that I won't get into right now, but I think you've heard some of them before.
I guess you would, given enough time, they would.
Given enough time, one of two things will happen. Either the native forest will win and they will start to wink out, or things will decide they want to eat them. And they will have local predators. And the arc of these things is very long. It will take a long time for that to happen. In our lifetime, we will see them become more and more prolific. We are unlikely to probably see them hit the other side of that arc. But this has always happened. Species move around, nature is not static. Look at the history of everything that lives here. It all came from somewhere else at some point in its history. We used to be under a mile of ice, you know? There was a lot of change that happens over time. It's happening very quickly now, and it feels like it's our fault, which is tricky for some of us. But I try not to take on the responsibility of deciding who gets to live where, for a lot of reasons. And I will leave it at that. Sean.
Another zinger from Eli. What's your favorite species of tree?
Oh, I just remembered that I forgot to repeat your question immediately after you told me to repeat questions. So what's my favorite species of tree? I would say hemlock, because that's why I picked it to be the one that we used. But I also really, really love northern white cedars, which is why I picked the picture of the large northern white cedar.
One other from online, and since I have a microphone, I don't think you have to repeat.
Okay, great. I thought you said you were going to turn yours off. So.
Well, I didn't. Am I still on? Okay, all right, great. Thanks. All right, so this is from Ian online. Thank you for the talk. I'm curious how post-clear-cut forests, how they develop into homogeneity over time, thinking specifically about the vast stands of beech and maple, all relatively young and in competitive crowded space.
What was the question part? How do they develop?
How do post-clear-cut forests develop into homogeneity over time? So does that mean why are post-clear-cut forests not very diverse, or is it why?
Do you think they meant heterogeneity
I don't know.
over time?
Ian, get back to us with some clarification.
Well, I'll talk a little bit about for it. So a post-clear cut, everything's cut, and then what comes back, it all comes back at around the same time. So a lot of the trees end up being the same age. We have a big problem now with beech bark disease rolled through, killed a lot of our big mature beech trees, and then after you do a clear cut or something like that, you get a ton of root sprout. All the, you've got these root masses underground of still alive from the big dominant beech trees, and their main trunk has died from the disease, but the roots still have life and they send up root suckers. And if you disturb that soil surface with logging, you often get these thickets of beech, little like tiny things, and they grow up and never get very big because they're all part of the same root mass. And this happens with other species too. When you cut something down completely, you get all these sun-loving species like gray birch and aspens, which, remember I said in the beginning, hemlocks are super shade tolerant. Well, gray birch and aspen, they're kind of the other side of that. They're super, super sun-loving. They want to be out in the sunshine, and they'll grow really fast as a result. But they'll often start all at once, and then they'll all grow at the same time, and they crowd each other out, so they can't actually get very big. They're all competing at kind of the same height and like holding each other down. And so in the forestry world, you would go in and you would thin that, and you would cut some out so that the ones that are left get to grow bigger. In forest stand development, going like way back to like stand development theory papers about it in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. There's a stage that was referred to as the stem exclusionary phase. That's where all of those ones that are all the same size, some of them would just lose the battle and they would die and fall down. That's like a normal part of forest development. Takes a while, it's yucky to look at. If your management goal is wood products, you don't want to look at that forest for 20, 30 years thinning itself out naturally. So you go in there and you thin it. But if your goal is not wood products, if your goal is something else, it's habitat, or if you're a newt and you live on the forest floor and you don't want to get squashed by a skidder, you might be okay with a bunch of little pole-sized trees for quite a long time until they thin themselves out naturally. So hopefully that answered the question, but I don't actually know what the question was.
Well, you managed to answer it. So yeah, kind of the second part of that. So I think basically keep going on the same theme. So Ian says, so forest stands that are homogeneous hardwoods, like the same species, age, like an even age stand, how do you get from there to like an old forest? Like what is the process of development to go from that into something that is
more
old and
structurally
complex
diverse?
Yeah.
Okay, well, time. Time is how you do it. And so little trees they'll compete with each other, they'll hold each other down, but there's this sort of theory, I guess, that I hear people say to me all the time, which is like, they're all just gonna be like the same small trees forever, and they're not gonna be able to beat each other, and so they're just gonna be stuck there. And that's just not how forests work. We get things like windstorms, we get snow damage, we get ice damage, we get small disturbances that churn things up, that knock down some of those, or a beaver comes in and thins out a bunch of it, or a moose comes in and just like crashes over it all, because that's what they do in the winter. They walk over trees to bend them over so they can eat the buds on the top of them. And so they don't just, like, it's not just like a bunch of little sticks just sort of slowly stuck on each other. In nature, things happen that give them that heterogeneity. It takes time, and again, our life cycles, I would put that graph back up and show that like our lifespan is short, and when we think about forests, we think about them in our own lifespan. So we see something that's all the same size for a year or 2 or 3, and we're like, uh-oh, I need to do something for them. But this is how they develop. I mean, in old forests, there are patches of young forest, and that's because natural disturbance can clear big swaths. A microburst can blow down a whole forest, a big patch of it, 5 acres, 10 acres, sometimes stand replacing at like a scale of 100 acres. And those come back in the same way with a whole bunch of little tiny trees. I took an old forest class here a couple years ago before I started teaching the old forest class here. And they use the term the anti-gap, right? You have a forest, and then you get a blowdown, and then there's this big light area, and what goes in there? Well, an anti-gap. It was a hole, and now it's so full of stuff because there's light there and there isn't light anywhere else that it gets super thick in just that one area. And that patchy heterogeneity is part of what makes old forests cool, because they have young forests in them, and they have old forests in them, and they have middle-aged forests in them. And all of those are important pieces of that process. And they all take different amounts of time. And nature never does anything on any perfect schedule, even though we draw lines on timelines and charts and we color code them and stuff. Like, nature doesn't care. Some of those are gonna look kind of young for 100 years maybe, and then they're gonna start to look old and thin out. Whereas other ones, a wind will whip through and then it'll start to look older really fast because it'll function in the same way as a thinning by a forester does. So if your objective on the land is not for wood products, you can wait and let those processes play out. And probably a lot of the things that live there would appreciate that, right? Because equipment is scary and it makes a lot of noise, and cutting trees down means that maybe your favorite place to build your nest as a winter wren goes away, and you can't get it back once it's cut down. So when we sort of look at from other perspectives, hurrying along that forest development becomes less important than feeling comfortable in our home. And that's just a different set of objectives. Oh, I got a question here in the front row.
Thanks for the talk, Shelby. I have 2 questions, actually. One's just a pop quiz, sort of. Do you have any idea how many times that forest was cut before 2003?
His question was, do I know how many times that forest was cut before 2003? And my answer is no, I don't.
Do you have a guess? I mean,
No.
I have no idea how frequently the Northeast was logged. You know?
I would guess several. I would guess that it was cleared originally for agriculture to some extent. Maybe it was silvopasture, I'm not sure. So there may have been trees that were retained, but there was probably some level of clearing because there's definitely barbed wire out there. And then a forest came back, but looking at the age of what's out there today, I would guess that there have been sort of several passes over the last couple hundred years.
Cool. And then the other question was, if the rewilding process, if the passive rewilding process takes place, how small of a parcel can you have and have it happen? Because obviously it can't be too tiny, or there's just not enough space for trees to fall down and do all that, right? And if there's a lot of disturbance around the land around it, that's a problem too. So how small of a parcel do you think can be rewilded in that way?
You're really testing my question repeat skills.
You can see
How small of a parcel is too small for rewilding is the gist of your question. And I like to say rewilding happens at many scales. So there are certainly edge effects, and there's papers out there that say the like minimum functional size for wilderness, where you get all the functions of wilderness, is 5,000 acres, and that's great, but it's also not really practical in a lot of the Northeast. Like 5,000 acre chunks of land don't come along that often, and when you're thinking about a landscape that is mostly private and that is mostly smaller than 5,000 acre parcels, the rewilding process can happen at different scales. You might not get 100% of those functions, but you'll get a lot of them. And there's a movement to rewild your own backyard right now. There's movements to just like mow a little bit less. I bought a house a couple years ago. I stopped mowing the lawn. I just mow funny little paths through it. And it has grown up in wildflowers, and I'm rewilding my lawn, and I think it's great, even though it doesn't have all the functions of a 5,000 acre wilderness. So I think it depends who you're thinking about, what you're looking at, but I think it can function. Rewilding can happen at any scale in any place, and there are things that benefit from it. Like a newt or a slime mold's whole world might be, an acre or less, and so me not mowing my lawn could be a really wonderful thing for some bees, some local bees, some butterflies, some newts and toads and other salamanders and things. And that's their whole home range might be in those unmowed portions of my lawn. Whereas, I think a lot of times when people hear rewilding, they think about like the big, fun, charismatic megafauna like cougars and wolves and stuff, bears. And they all also benefit from small-scale rewilding. Like little patches of wild stuff gives them cover to move through a more developed landscape. But they do need the bigger patches to like raise their young and find enough food to live and stuff like that. So my answer is everything. It was a very long-winded way of saying it. Any other questions? Oh, we got one here.
Looking at forests from the point of view of the eye of the deer,
Yes.
one of their favorite trees is the red oak,
Mm-hmm.
small, tiny ones. And one of the objectives of old growth forests is to raise more red oaks. So, what do you think the deer's thinking about that?
Well, okay. When you say one of the objectives of the old growth forest is to have more red oaks, do you mean like if the deer was managing it, they would want more?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So the question was, if a deer was managing a forest and wanted more red oak, but also really enjoyed eating baby red oaks, I guess like how do we get there? And I think the answer is that, well, that's kind of what I was talking about with all that stuff on the ground. Like as a forest gets older, stuff gets on the ground, and then trees are able to grow in places where deer can't get to them. And we are really worried right now about deer in the Northeast because they're eating a lot of our regeneration. You can go into a lot of those middle-aged forests and see that every little tree has been like grazed to the ground and can't get anywhere. There's not a new cohort of young trees coming up under these middle-aged forests because the deer are grazing everything. Well, time, hopefully, will cause some of those middle-aged trees to get bigger, and they'll fall down and they'll make a big mess, and the deer won't be able to get into that mess, and then oaks will grow up in there, particularly because another voracious lover of oaks is squirrels, and they like to take the acorns and hide them in places that are sort of tucked away in big logs and piles and thickets and stuff, and they can grow there, they'll be tucked there, and they can sort of safely grow, hopefully, over time. Deer are a challenge for our forest right now. We have a lot of deer, and the deer don't have a lot of predators, mostly cars, honestly. So deer eating young trees is something that we're struggling with, particularly because our forests are really simple, and the ground is really flat, and everything's just sort of laid out like a big, beautiful buffet for them, so they eat everything they can. But adding some of that complexity back will help some of those trees survive. I think there are places where deer browse is so bad that they're seeing like complete understory collapse. I've been told tales of it. I have not actually seen it myself. But I do think up here in the Northeast, our deer populations are not so high that that's happening. You still get, when trees fall down and you get a gap, you still get all sorts of things coming up in it. What is happening is that the composition of what's coming back is shifting, because it's shifting away from the types of trees that deers really like to eat. And the things that tend to make it tall enough are the things that aren't as delicious for them. So I don't think I answered your question, but I talked around it a whole lot. Is that enough? Do you want me to say more?
You actually did.
Oh, okay, great.
You did great.
Did you have another question from online?
No, this is just from Sean.
Oh, okay.
I'm just like I'm wondering about kind of like the rewilding management philosophy, and how, you know, when we look at our forests today, they're damaged by a lot of things that we've done to them over the last couple hundred years. And, you know, in many cases, the seed banks have been like depopulated because there was farming on it for 200 years. So of course there's no more, you know, whatever seeds there. Or there's been invasive introduced that are on the landscape that weren't before. Or that there's logging roads or other just major changes to the watershed and the drainage patterns, and like totally changing the hydrology. So all these things have happened. And I think there's a lot of concern that, you know, before you like if your goal is to make a wilderness, you know, should you try to go and fix those things first and then let it go? Or should you just let it go and trust that those things will fix themselves, but not on the human timeline that we care about? Right? So I'm wondering like how you approach that, of like you're trying to as a human protect these forests. You're also trying to think about all these problems that have been caused of the human timeline, while also using these timelines that are like, you know, hundreds and hundreds of years out into the future. So anyway, I'm just wondering how you like wrestle with those.
I'm really glad you're mic'd up and I don't have to repeat that question. That was a bear. Okay, so all right, putting my Northeast Wilderness Trust hat on, when we protect a new property, do we feel the need to go in and do things to prepare it to passively rewild? The answer is typically no, with a little asterisk beside it. So sometimes we do things, we call it trammel removing, which is from the terminology in the Wilderness Act. Wilderness is defined as untrammeled, and trammels, everyone thinks that means like untrampled or not stepped on a lot. But what trammeled actually means is deprived of freedom, and untrammeled is not deprived of freedom. And so it's about sort of letting nature have freedom. And so when we buy a property, if there's a culvert in it, or a poorly designed road crossing that is causing head cuts, which is when the stream erodes up away from the road crossing. Those sort of hydrologic problems that just sort of get worse, and you start losing topsoil and you start losing soil. And anytime you lose soil carbon, and you lose all the seed bank and benefits of the soil when it starts eroding. Those things we will sometimes fix. We'll pull perched culverts and take out kind of really egregious road systems if we have the resources, and make sort of some of those like upfront fixes, so that when we do let it go, it's in a better position to recover on its own. We don't take that approach with other things, like sometimes we get a property that has a field on it, and we just let that field be whatever that field wants to be. And the reason for that is that I'm not trying to protect a museum of what nature here used to be. I'm trying to protect the sort of vibrant and resilient ecosystems of the future. And those might have some species in them that weren't here 100 years ago. And I'm sorry, folks, but I don't think you're going to get rid of them. So I think they're just going to be here. So having them in the forest, in whatever comes in, is probably just part of the resilient forest of the future. And hopefully, predators and things will learn to eat them, and that sort of arc will complete, and they will stop being the most abundant thing and start being just sort of another cast another member in the cast of players on the forest stage. I don't know, I took that one too far. But yeah, so we're trying to just sort of not deprive a place of freedom, let it be what it wants to be, and sometimes that's going to be a thing that makes us feel a little uncomfortable. It gets really, really tricky when you start thinking about things like endangered species, and you're like, oh, what if there's something endangered there, and then we just do nothing and it goes away. So that's where you get into sticky wickets, and we start having real conversations with our board. Should we do things? What should we do? And I don't have an answer for that. There is no blanket answer for that. That's always going to be case by case. You're going to make those decisions as you come to them. But by and large, we're going to do pretty minimal upfront work to get it ready to be wild, and then we're just going to let it be wild and see what happens.
Any last questions from in the room?
Seems like it.
All right, and no further questions from outside the room. So I think we'll wrap things up there. Shelby, thank you very much.
Special thank you to all of you for coming here on this frosty night.